to record. So this week we start the second book of the Torah, the book of Exodus, and I'll recite the blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So the narrative continues. So the entire book of Genesis is written in narrative form. The book of Exodus continues that style, so it serves as a nice transition, even though it's a new book. So the style remains the same until chapter 20 in the book, when it shifts. No, chapter 21. We'll see when we get there, the portion Mishpatim, that there's a drastic shift from narrative to law. So as this narrative continues, we'll see how the rabbis add to their comment on the book. And I was, those of us, just one second, somebody else coming in. Those of us who were in shul on Shabbat or watched shul on Shabbat and stayed to the end, heard me share a bizarre Midrash about the mourning for Jacob that took place in the land of Israel at a place called Goren HaAtad, the threshing floor of Atad, which means thorn bush. And I shared bizarre Midrash about that. So that kind of inspired me, because this opening portion in the book of Exodus also has some interesting Midrash. Not as bizarre as what I shared on Shabbat about the son of Dan clubbing Esau to death, but still rather strange, but still pointing to what are some of the elements of rabbinic midrash, what they're trying to do. So I want us to start right away at the very beginning on page 317 in the Eitz Chaim, whatever Chumash you're using, Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. Ve'ele Shemot b'nei Yisrael. So it's just interesting that the book starts with the letter Vav, and. So all of us who took English in elementary school or middle school or high school know that you're not supposed to start a sentence with the word and. That's not good writing. You know, if you're writing a novel or if you're writing a poem, well, you do whatever you want. But if you're in the English teacher's class, you would have a red mark through the and to start the sentence. You just don't do that. And the English translation leaves it out. So the letter Vav there, I think, is important, just to point out that this is, we're continuing the story from where we left off in Genesis last week. So so verse 26 on page 311, Joseph died at 110 years old. He was embalmed and he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And then the very next sentence, and these are the names, Ve'ele Shemot b'nei Yisrael. These are the names of the children of Israel. So b'nei Yisrael is the term for the community of Israelites, but here specifically, they're still the sons of Israel. Habaim Mitzrayma, who came to Egypt, et Yaakov ish uveto va'u, with Jacob, man and household came, or each coming with his household. And then we have the list, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. So there given in chronological birth order. Yisachar, Zevulun, Uvinyamin, Dan, V'Naftali, Gad, V'Asher. But Yosef is not listed. Vayehi kol nefesh yotzei Yerech Yaakov, and it was that all the people who were the product of Jacob's loins, Shiv'im nefesh, they were 70 people. V'Yosef haya b'Mitzrayim, and Joseph was in Egypt. Okay, now we might think that this is a standard introduction to a new book, just providing us the background. Who are the characters that we need to be aware of and to be reminded of? That remember, all of the sons of Jacob came down to Egypt and met Joseph. Wasn't Benjamin born after Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher? Yes. So it started in chronological order, but then the order got messed up. And why is that? Why is the order? There is no commentary about it as to why it goes out of order. So I don't know. So Paul, throughout the Torah, the order is very different. As we know, from Hanukkah a couple of weeks ago, when we read the 12 days in which each of the tribes presented gifts for the dedication of the Mishkan, those 12 tribes are not listed in birth order. So why it is, and also how the tribes are listed in the census and the various censuses that are in the book of Numbers, they're also not in birth order. So I really don't know. I'm sure there are scholars who have written about the order and why they're out of order, and I don't know. But there is an interesting comment below the line about, like I was saying, this is a standard introduction, but the commentaries point out an interesting lesson. What does this mean? What is the impact? Excuse me. What is the impact of us being reminded of their names here at this point in the story in which the people are about to become enslaved? Okay, so if we look below the line on 317, under where it says chapter 1 in the left-hand column, I want to start with the second paragraph, the sages of the Midrash. So if you see where I am below the line on 317, the sages of the Midrash, writing more than 1,000 years after the events and living under the harsh rule of the Romans, try to interpret the experience of slavery in Egypt as a way of understanding their own experience. Okay, so even though we haven't read yet that the Israelites are enslaved, we know that that's what's about to happen. Okay, so the rabbis who are living not quite enslaved to the Romans, but under harsh persecution and oppression, apply some of the principles of the Torah and slavery to their own experience. Okay, so how are they doing that? Some said, so there are two schools of thought in rabbinic literature and in the Midrash about how we're supposed to respond to the oppressive authority, living as a minority in the oppressive majority of the Roman Empire. Some said that slavery was a punishment for assimilating into the Egyptian way of life and wanting to be like the Egyptians. Okay, so it'll go on just one second. I just want to elaborate here for a moment to say that a response to slavery or a response to persecution could be, well, if they don't know I'm Jewish, maybe they won't persecute me. So if I can pretend to be Roman and I can look Roman and I can have a Roman name, and I can speak Latin, and I'll take on Roman custom, maybe by assimilating into Roman culture, I'll be protected from persecution and oppression. So some said that slavery was a punishment for assimilating into the Egyptian way of life and wanting to be like the Egyptians. They interpreted the words, the land was filled with them. So we haven't gotten there yet. So it's verse 6 I didn't read yet. So let me read 6 and 7. Vayamat Yosef v'chol echav, Joseph and all his brothers died, v'chol hador hahu, and that entire generation. Uvenei Yisrael, and the children of Israel, paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu v'ya'atzmu b'ma'od ma'od. They were fruitful and swarmed and multiplied and became great, very great, very, very great, ma'od ma'od, v'timale ha'aretz otam, and the land was filled with them. Okay, so with a comment on that, they interpreted the words, the land was filled with them, to mean the theaters and circuses were filled with them, right? So they're projecting back. If under Roman times we have theaters and circuses, then they had theaters and circuses in Egypt as well. And the being filled with them means that the Israelites were filling the stands, that they are attending the theaters and the circuses. The Israelites adopted the Egyptian way of life in all of its crudeness and superficiality. Thus, psychological enslavement, the notion that being an Egyptian was better than being an Israelite, preceded physical enslavement, even as psychological liberation will later precede physical liberation, right? So they became like the Egyptians. They were fruitful and multiplied and became prolific, as the English translation says. And the rabbis are saying that they attended theaters and circuses. They took advantage of Egyptian culture and became like the Egyptians. So they became psychologically enslaved before they became physically enslaved. These commentators describe the Israelites as devoid of redeeming qualities and see the Exodus as resulting from God's unearned grace and God's promise to the patriarchs, right? So the Exodus happened not through any benefit, no, not through any reason that the Israelites themselves gave, that there wasn't a merit on their part. It was because of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that God reluctantly had to fulfill the promise. Okay, so school of thought number one for the rabbis is that the Israelites became assimilated into Egyptian society and that they brought slavery upon themselves. Others, as the commentary goes on now, the next paragraph, others saw enslavement in Egypt as part of God's long-range plan, foreshadowed in Genesis 15, to take the descendants of Abraham and teach them through the experience of being enslaved and redeemed to be sensitive to the oppressed in every age. As Exodus 22 says, you shall not wrong a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and to be grateful to God for intervening to free them. So the other point is that slavery happened because God wanted it to happen. It was part of God's master plan that God had foretold to Abraham back in chapter 15 of Genesis, right? Your descendants will end up in Egypt, and they will be brought out with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. That's part of the covenant that God makes with Abraham back then. So Exodus, the book of Exodus, is a fulfillment of God's promise through suffering, and that by our suffering, we learn how to be sensitive to other people's suffering. So there's this slavery happened not because we wanted it to happen because we brought it on ourselves, but rather because God wanted it to happen. Okay, and then it goes on to say, on the opening words of the book, these are the names. The sages commented, again with later generations in mind, that the Israelites were worthy of being redeemed precisely because they did not assimilate. Right? First paragraph said they did assimilate. They filled up the theaters and circuses, and then they had enslavement coming to them. Here this says, no, they did not assimilate, and therefore they were worthy of being redeemed. Through all the years of slavery, they did not change their names, their language, or their mode of dress. Right? So the opening verses of Exodus, with reminding us of who the original sons of Jacob were and their Hebrew names, is a lesson for the rabbis that the Israelites maintained their Hebrew identity in Egypt. Okay, so two very different, opposite schools of thought from the very opening lines. The land was filled with them, leads to some rabbis thinking that the Israelites themselves became like the Egyptians and filled the theaters and circuses. These are the names, and being reminded of the Hebrew names leads to the other school of thought that the Hebrews did not become assimilated, and they fought against the influences of outside culture, so that rabbis teaching in Roman times, some were saying that there's a benefit to Roman society and that we Jews should adopt some Roman norms and practices, and other rabbis who would preach just the opposite. No, Rome is evil. Anything Roman is terrible for Jewish society, and we should stay far away from Roman influence. So these are themes in rabbinic literature about the pros and cons of the outside culture and outside influence. Okay, so we can't help but so that's why ultra-Orthodox Jews wear black coats and black hats to maintain a very separate, pronounced Jewish identity. And then there are others, just look around the Zoom screen and see how we're dressed. We're dressed like everybody else in America. And there's nothing wrong with that. Our hairstyles, to the extent that we have hair, our hairstyles are just like everybody else's hairstyle. There's nothing distinctly Jewish about my appearance or your appearance. We look American, like any other American. You could have a random. The only thing that by looking at our Zoom screens that smack of Judaism is behind me. What's on the wall behind me, and the two pieces of art that have Jewish stars on them, and behind Jules, the word shalom. If you took away our backgrounds and just inserted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other people, random people with no backgrounds, we'd look at exactly the same. Okay, but what the rabbis are saying here is that a good thing or not? Yes, Jan.
Also, your kippot.
The kippot. Okay, yes, that's true.
Wearing a kippot.
Absolutely true. That's fascinating, Jan, because I don't even know sometimes that I'm wearing it. Okay,
but I think that's something that, like, an ordinary, not Jewish American would.
No, that's absolutely true,
not
Jan.
wear.
You're absolutely right, and that's a duh. But like I said, I don't even know I'm wearing it half the time. Okay, so yes, thank you for pointing that out. Most of the men here have their head covered with a kippah, but because I have to bend my head down pretty far for you to see it, I wasn't noticing it. So, and again, like I said, I don't even know sometimes that I have it on, which defeats the purpose of wearing it. Right? The whole idea of wearing a kippah or wearing a talit and wearing tefillin, you become so used to wearing these garments that you even don't know half the time that you have it on. It defeats the purpose of having it on, because the point of wearing the kippah is to be reminded of God above us. And the point of wearing the talit and the tefillin are to remind us of the commandments. And so we wear these special garments to be constantly reminded while we're praying why we're praying. So if we don't even know that you have it on, then you really have to rethink why we're wearing it. Okay, so that was point number one about the rabbinic perspective that the Eitz Chaim commentary brings to us about slavery and about living, and more generally about living as a minority in a majority population, and how we are as Jews supposed to maintain our Jewish identity, to what extent we're supposed to do it, and how good or bad is assimilation. So that's a question. It was a question when I was in rabbinical school. The whole idea of intermarriage and the high rates of intermarriage, I mean, that was what the Jewish community talked about when I entered rabbinical school in the mid-1980s. Now, nobody talks about it anymore. Intermarriage is a given, and the Jewish community and those who study trends in the Jewish community don't talk about intermarriage anymore. They talk more about the nature of Jewish identity today in general, and how diverse the Jewish community is, and how non-uniform the community is. In other words, back in the day before computers, the Jewish community was, I'd say before the internet, I mean. So before the internet, the Jewish community was pretty unified, and that Jews knew that if you wanted to be Jewish, you had to go to synagogue, and that was the address. Today, so 35 years after I entered rabbinical school, 1994 was the year the internet was created, let's say, or invented, whether Al Gore invented it or not. 1994, so how many years? That's 27 years ago. Since then, there is no sense of what it means to be Jewish anymore in the classic term. And so, you can't talk anymore about something, one particular item that is a unifying challenge to the Jewish community. It's a whole diverse kind of thing, a whole ball of wax, and it's really very difficult for Jewish sociologists of the Jewish community to really get a better handle on how to define what it means to be Jewish anymore. Okay, so that all of that based on the very beginning of this portion. I also wanted to get to some of the interesting Midrash that I promised that we would get to. So I want us, let's continue reading in the Hebrew, beginning with verse 8. So we continue with verse 8 on 3:18, or chapter 1, verse 8. Vayakom melech chadash al Mitzrayim, there arose a new king over Egypt, asher lo yada et Yosef, asher lo yada et Yosef, who did not know Joseph. Vayomer el amo, and he said to his people, Hine, behold, Am b'nei Yisrael, the nation of the children of Israel, which is fascinating in its own right. This is the first time that the children of Israel, literally the children of Israel, are called the nation of Israel. Okay, so this is the first time that the word Am is used to designate the people, the community as a nation. Like the song Am Yisrael Chai, the nation of Israel lives. Am can also mean group, but it's in modern Hebrew, it means nation. Am B'nai Yisrael Rav Atzumi Menu. The people of the children of Israel are great and mighty than us, or are much too numerous for us. They're getting too big for us. Hava nitchak malo. Let's outwit them. Pen yirbeh, unless they continue to grow in number. V'haya ki tikrena milchama, and maybe they'll proclaim a war. V'nosaf gamhu al sonenu, and they'll be added to the list of our enemies. V'nilcham banu, and they'll war against us. V'ala min haaretz, and they'll get out of the land. Right? They might think that they're so numerous that they have the chance maybe to take over, or at least to revolt against the Egyptians. And we have to keep in mind that everybody's enslaved at this point. The entire people are enslaved because of what Joseph set down in terms of people selling their land and selling their own bodies in order to get food. So we're still in the process of people being, the entire population being enslaved in some way to Pharaoh. So verse 11, Vayasimu alav sarei misim, so they set upon them taskmasters, lama'an anoto besivlotam, to oppress them with forced labor. Vayiven arei miskenot, and they built garrison cities, lifaro, for Pharaoh, at Pitom ve'et Ramses. They built the cities of Pitom and Ramses. So you think maybe the Israelites built the pyramids. That's not really true, but they built these cities. That was the Israelites' task, and they harsh taskmasters were working them, and they built these cities. V'cha'asher ya'anu oto, and while they were suffering, being oppressed, Kain yirbeh v'chein yifrotz, they nonetheless were still fruitful and multiplied. Vayakutsu, and they spread out mipnei b'nei Yisrael, so that Vayakutsu, the Egyptians dreaded the people of Israel. So 13 and 14, Vayavidu Mitzrayim et b'nei Yisrael b'farach, the Egypt worked and ruthlessly imposed the Israelites' backbreaking work. Vayimararu et chayehem, they embittered their lives ba'avodah kasha, with hard work. Bechomer uvil venim, with mortar and bricks. Uvachol avodah basadeh, and working in the field. Et kol avodatam asher avdu vahem befarach, whatever work they made them do, it was back-breaking, laborious. Now, verse 15, here's the first place where I want to bring in some Midrash. Vayomer melech Mitzrayim. So the king of Egypt said, La miyaladot ha'ivriot, to the Hebrew midwives, asher shem ha'achat Shifra, whose one name was Shifra, and shem ha'shenit Puah. The name of the other was Puah. And he told them, 1 second, we'll get back to this, Vayomer, and he said, B'yalet chenet ha'ivriot, when you help the Hebrews give birth, Ureiten al ha'ovnayim, and you saw on the birth stool, im benhu, if it's a son, if it's a boy, v'hamiten oto, you're supposed to kill the boy, v'im bati, if it's a girl, v'chaya, let it live. Okay, so there's Midrash here on who Shifra and Puah are. Okay, so this is just standard narrative about just setting the groundwork for why all the Jewish boys, all the Israelite boys are going to be thrown into the Nile, which is going to happen in a couple of sentences. So who are who are Shifra and Puah. So we never see Shifra and Puah again in the Torah. Okay, so that's a clue for the rabbis to say, if we never see them again, maybe Shifra and Puah are really other people that we do see again. And maybe they're just other names. So they say that Shifra and Puah are none other than Yocheved and Miriam. Yocheved being Moses' mother, and Miriam being Moses' sister. Okay, so Yocheved and Miriam are the two women here, Shifra and Puah. And why are they called Shifra and Puah? Because of what the names Shifra and Puah mean in Hebrew. So, for example, they say, because Shifra, the one is called Shifra because she used to make the baby good looking, meshaperet, improving. So that's what Shifra means, to improve. So the improve and Puah. Why is she called Puah? Because she used to make bubbles, no fa'at, there's pei ayin in there, and no fa'at with wine before the baby in the presence of her mother. So the other thing, that if it's Yocheved and Miriam, and this is happening in real time, then Miriam's about 5 years old, a little bit young to be working as a midwife. So really there's only one midwife, Yocheved, and Miriam comes along to kind of help and maybe to play with the other children or to help distract the mother while giving birth. So she would make bubbles with wine, like she would fill her mouth with wine and maybe blow bubbles by blowing the wine out of her mouth. So that's one idea of Shifra and Puah. Now here's another idea. This other idea is based on chapter 2. We just have to look ahead to chapter 2. And the rabbis do this all the time. The rabbis assume we've read the whole story already. So it's acceptable to them to look ahead and look to something that comes ahead and incorporate that into the commentary for right now. Okay, so in chapter 2, if Shifra and Puah are Yocheved and Miriam, then it raises a question in chapter 2. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. Okay, so this man and woman are Amram and Yocheved, and this is the birth of Moses. If this is the birth of Moses, we know that he already has a brother and a sister, Aaron and Miriam, because Miriam is going to be following him when he's put in the basket in the Nile. So why is the marriage of Amram and Yocheved being described here if they're married already? You following what I'm saying here? Chapter 2 makes it seem that they just got married. And if it's the birth of Moses that's being described, which it is, then if they just got married, then Moses is their only child. Why would they have children out of wedlock? But we know that Moses has an older brother and older sister in Aaron and Miriam. So how could that be? So here's the story that the rabbis explain. So Puah, why is she called Puah? Why is Miriam called Puah? Because she dared to reprove her father. So the word for reprove is from the same root as pei ayin vav, Puah. So how did she reprove her father? Amram was at that time the head of the Sanhedrin. Okay, this is very typical of the rabbis to project back into history institutions that they have already in their time, that even that they even created themselves. So the institution of the Sanhedrin was created by the rabbis 2,000 years ago. So around the turn of the millennium. So if that's the case, the rabbis themselves created the institution of rabbinic Judaism and created the institution of the Sanhedrin. But when they created it, they said, we didn't create this out of nothing. They were already there before us. And we know in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that the Great Assembly is referred to. Like there's a group of elders that Ezra and Nehemiah used as advisors when they left Babylonia and went back to the land of Israel. So that's clue number one for the rabbis. Oh, the Great Assembly, that must have been the early Sanhedrin. And if the Sanhedrin's there, that's got to be all the way back in the Torah. So that the children of Noah, his son Shem, Ham, and Japhet are three sons of Noah. Shem, Semites, from the Shem son, anti-Semitism. Semites are from the son Shem. So we're descended from Shem. Shem and his grandson Aver, for the rabbis, they set up the rabbinical academies in Israel. So the rabbinical academies go back to, they predate Abraham. So that's important for the rabbis, that the institutions themselves of Torah and Sanhedrin and Jewish law all predate the characters themselves in the Torah. Okay, so it's not unusual for the rabbis to say something like, Amram was at that time the head of the Sanhedrin. And when Pharaoh decreed that if it be a son, you shall kill him, which we just read, when Pharaoh told the midwives, kill all the boys that you birth, but you can keep the girls alive, Amram said it was useless for the Israelites to beget children. So we can't fight the decree, Amram said, as head of the Sanhedrin. Forthwith, he ceased to have marital relations with his wife, Yocheved, and even divorced his wife, though she was already 3 months pregnant. So she was pregnant with Moses, already had Aaron and Miriam. He divorces her because of Pharaoh's decree, whereupon all the Israelites arose and divorced their wives. Then said his daughter to him, Miriam said to Amram, why she's called Puah, because she's reproving her father to his face, your decree is more severe than that of Pharaoh. For Pharaoh decreed only concerning the male children, right? We have a 50-50 chance. Girls we can let live. And you decree upon males and females alike. If you say everybody's to get divorced, there's no child being born at all. So you're doing one up on Pharaoh. How dare you do that? Besides Pharaoh being wicked, there's some doubt whether his decree will be fulfilled or not. But you're righteous and your decree will be fulfilled, right? The Hebrew midwives might not pay attention to Pharaoh, which is true. They don't pay attention to his decree and they let everybody live. Whereas you, everybody's listening to you because you're the head of the Sanhedrin. So you'll also do more damage than Pharaoh. So what did Amram do in response to his daughter? He took his wife back and followed by all the Israelites who also took their wives back, which is why chapter 2, verse 1 says, a certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman, that he remarried. He had divorced her and then remarried her. Okay, so that's bizarre Midrash number 1. Okay, so the other Midrash I want to share with you, because I'm not sure I'm going to get to the third one, is verse 21. So so we're just skipping ahead a couple sentences. The midwives don't pay attention to Pharaoh's decree, and because of that, the Hebrew women are giving birth furiously. Verse 20, Vayitev Elohim lameyaladot, vayirev ha'am vayatzmu ma'od. God was good to the midwives, and the people grew in great number. Vayehi, and it came to pass, verse 21, Ki yaru hamialdot eta Elohim, that when the midwives were fearing God, vayas lahem batim, that they that was established for them houses. Verse 22, Vayetzav paro l'chol amo lemor, Pharaoh commanded his people, saying, Kol haben hayilod, every boy that is born, hayaora tashlichuhu, throw him into the Nile, v'chol habat techayun, but leave the girls alive. The question is, who's Pharaoh consulting in order to issue these decrees? According to the Torah, he's not consulting anybody. He's consulting in a vacuum. He's not consulting at all. It's just by himself. He's issuing decree all by himself. For the rabbis, that's not the way it works. Leaders, rulers, emperors, kings have a cabinet, have a royal court. So Pharaoh must have had a royal court. The Torah just doesn't tell us about it, but it's important for the rabbis to tell us who are the advisors in Pharaoh's court. And when I tell you these names, it might seem bizarre, but it makes sense at the same time. So, and now, right. Let me just pick up here. So there's the first Midrash I read for you is from this English translation of one collection of Midrash called Midrash Rabbah. Okay. There's another great resource called Legends of the Jews, edited by H.L. Ginsberg. Okay. He was a professor at the seminary more than 100 years ago. His number one research assistant was Henrietta Zold, the founder of Hadassah, and she would have been the first female rabbi if the seminary would have let her, because she could have had a PhD in Talmud, which and essentially this 7-volume Legends of the Jews was really written by Henrietta Zold, but it has H.L. Ginsberg's name on it. Okay, so that's just my plug there for Hadassah and Henrietta Zold. So putting all these midrashim together, the Legends of the Jews tells the story of the Bible in terms of how the midrash tells the story. So instead of jumping back and forth from one midrash to the Talmud to another midrash, you find it in one narrative form in the Legends of the Jews. Okay, so it says here, Pharaoh arose early in the morning, called together all his servants and his wise men to interpret his dream being that there's a sheep on one side of the scale that outweighed all the other nations of the world that were on the other side of the scale. And he wanted to know, he consulted with his advisors, what does this dream mean? Balaam, the son of Beor, spoke and said, so this is a number one advisor to Pharaoh is Balaam. Balaam, who appears for the first time in the book of Numbers, the one who's called by the king of Moab to curse the people of Israel. And he blesses them instead, including Matovu, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob. That's the Balaam that we know. He's the one who rode the donkey. The donkey saw the angel. The donkey says out loud to Balaam, why are you hitting me? So the talking donkey, all of that part of the Balaam story, that's the first time in the book of Numbers that we see Balaam. But for the rabbis, no, that's not the first time. The first time is going to be here in Exodus, who he is and why he hates the Israelites so much. And to provide the background for the story in Numbers as to why Balaam was willing to curse the Israelites. Because of what happened here in Egypt when Balaam, was an advisor to Pharaoh and told Pharaoh how to deal with the Israelites, and still the Israelites confounded all the plans. So Balaam, the son of Beor, spoke and said, this means nothing but that a great evil will spring up against Egypt, for a son will be born unto Israel, who will destroy the whole of our land and all its inhabitants, and he will bring forth the Israelites from Egypt with a mighty hand. I just want to pause there for a second. A son will be born. It's fascinating to me that the book of Exodus begins with the birth of Moses, and that portion, we're reading the book of Shemot, the first portion on Shemot on Christmas. A son will be born. Okay, I just think that that's fascinating. And I think that the rabbis found that fascinating also, because all the stories about the birth of Jesus that are in the Christian Bible and all other legends, right? A light shining in the sky, the three wise men coming to Bethlehem, the whole story, right? That the king of Israel or the Roman emperor being told, oh, there's a new king has arisen, right? So all of that Midrash, I'm calling it Midrash because that's what it is. Stories of the birth of Jesus that become part of Christian tradition, religious tradition, were written at the same time that Midrash about the birth of Moses was written. So it's not coincidental that aspects of both stories are interchangeable. When Moses is born, in chapter 2 here, the Midrash says, when Moses is born, the Midrash says a light started to shine in the house. Okay, so there's a light shining there. There's Pharaoh having a dream that or the advisors having a dream or a vision that there's a son, a leader, a ruler is being born, which Pharaoh will have no control over, and is going to defeat Pharaoh. Okay, so same thing, a ruler is coming who's going to defeat the Roman Empire. Just fascinating stuff, and it all coincides this Shabbat on Christmas with the first portion of Exodus. Just fascinating stuff. Okay, so that I wanted to share that too. So Balaam is one advisor. The king said to Balaam, what do we do with Israel then? Okay, well, so just because you had this vision that there's going to be this son who's going to be born, who's going to lead them, what can we do to confound the vision? We have tried several devices against this people, but we could not prevail over it. Let me hear your opinion of what to do. So Balaam then, at Balaam's insistence, the story goes on, the king sent for his two counselors. Who are his two counselors? Jethro the Midianite and Job the Utsite. Okay, book of Job, found later in the Bible, in the writings section of the Bible. All we know is that he's Job from the land of Uz. Where is Uz? Who knows? When did he live? Who knows? But the rabbis create a lot of midrash to say that he, not only was he alive at the time of Pharaoh and the time of the Exodus, but they also suggest that he was alive at the time of Abraham. So he's one of these biblical figures that is nearly immortal. And why is Job selected in the book of Job for all his suffering? Because in the book of Job, it's random. It seems random. God and Satan say, oh, here's Job. All right, let's do this. Let's do this test with Job. But why? So the Midrash helps to explain, because Job gives the advice to Pharaoh how to kill the Israelites. And as punishment for giving this advice to Pharaoh, Job has the story about him later in the Bible, in the book of Job. So it's not random that the suffering that he has is because of the advice that he gave to Pharaoh. And Jethro, why does he end up in Midian if he's an advisor to Pharaoh, because Jethro, who becomes Moses's father-in-law, right? When Moses runs away from Egypt, which we also read in this week's portion, when he runs away after killing the Egyptian taskmaster, he ends up in Midian, and he falls in love with Sipporah, one of 7 daughters of Jethro. So who is this random Jethro? It's not random. So the Midrash makes it not random. These people who appear suddenly, well, we shouldn't understand them as appearing suddenly. They are these other people. And now the stories then become interconnected when we didn't think we should interconnect them before. Okay, so Job has advice and Jethro has advice. These are the counselors to Pharaoh. So I wanted to share these midrashim with you, and I know I was kind of rushing through it a little bit, but I wanted to just highlight for you what the purpose of the midrash is, and that it might seem kind of silly, some midrashim kind of silly or kind of gory, as the midrash that I shared on Shabbat was about the killing of Esau. But the whole backstory of Midrash is to say that the entire Bible is one long interconnected story. And that if we should not think that each book is a separate unit unto itself. All the books are interconnected, and they all reflect different aspects of other books. So that prophecies that are in Isaiah are fulfillments of something that happened earlier in the Torah. Book of Psalms, which respond to psychological pain and joy, are not just that, but they are also prophecies or fulfillment of prophecies that happen from the Torah or later in Jewish history. So for the rabbis, the Bible becomes a more intricate, mysterious, and profound book than it already is. And that's what I wanted to bring out in sharing these midrashim on the beginning of the book of Exodus. Yes, Sumner.
I was just curious. How long has it been estimated that the Jews were slaves?
Right. So it's not clear. It's not clear from the Torah how long it is. It seems like it's just one generation removed from the time of Joseph, but clearly it can't be one generation. It's impossible for 70 to increase to 600,000 in just one generation.
Yeah, right.
So most scholars agree that it's anywhere from 200 to 400 years, but we don't know for sure because there's no absolute archaeological historical evidence that has been uncovered to prove that how much time. And I just saw what Jan put in the chat, the Legends of the Jews. Yeah, my copy was donated to me by a retired rabbi in Philadelphia, Rabbi Max Farber, who my father was friends with at the time when I was entering rabbinical school. Rabbi Farber gave me a number of his collections. I have some Mishnah, I have the Midrash, I have Legends of the Jews, I have a couple other books on my shelf from Rabbi Farber, may he rest in peace. But of course, because the book is more than 100 years old, it's available for free and it's on Sefaria. So why bother buying it? Just read it on Sefaria. The fascinating, the most important part of the book is the notes. So there are 2 volumes just of an index on the other 5 volumes of the Legends of the Jews. So it's an incredible amount of research. Imagine before computers, how much research had to go into getting all the different books together and kind of writing the story based on all these midrashim. So, and it was just H.L. Ginsburg and Henrietta Zold doing all this work by themselves. Just incredible amount of scholarship at that time. All right, folks, Have a good rest of the day. Next week, I'm away on vacation. So I wish everybody a happy and a healthy new year. And I'll see you all the first Wednesday in January. So that's third, fourth, January 5th. We will meet again. Okay. And we'll already be into the 10 plagues and the Exodus itself.
Happy New Year.
All right. Happy New Year, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy New
Thank you.
Year.